Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Imagine living your entire life without a shower, without toilet paper, and with streets that rarely stayed clean for long. In the Middle Ages, daily hygiene looked nothing like the world we know today. Yet, people still found surprising ways to stay clean and survive in crowded towns and castles. From shared toilets built into castle walls to herbs carried to mask the smell of entire cities, the routines of medieval life reveal a world both shocking and strangely practical. Tonight, we step into that world to discover what everyday hygiene really looked like in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone from the modern world were to wake inside a small medieval village, the absence of a bath would be one of the first things they noticed. There would be no tiled bathroom, no steaming shower, and no faucet turning easily beneath the hand. Instead, the morning would begin in a wooden house that smelled faintly of smoke, damp straw, and the lingering presence of yesterday's work. People rose from their beds, dressed themselves in the same linen undergarments and wool clothing worn the day before, and stepped into another day without any expectation of washing their bodies completely. To modern minds, this sounds unpleasant or even shocking. But to people in the Middle Ages, it was simply how life worked. The main reason was practical rather than careless. Heating enough water for a bath required time, fuel, and effort that most households could not spare. Firewood had to be collected or purchased, and large quantities of water had to be carried from wells, streams, or communal pumps. Every bucket meant another trip across muddy yards or narrow village paths. When people already spent long days working in fields, workshops, or kitchens, the thought of heating several tubs of water just to wash the body rarely seemed worth the effort. Energy was reserved for cooking meals and warming the home, not for bathing. Even when water was available, preparing a bath remained a demanding process. Large metal or wooden tubs had to be filled slowly, often with water heated in kettles over open flames. It might take hours to gather enough warm water to fill the tub halfway. Families sometimes shared the same bath water to avoid wasting fuel, which meant the idea of a private bath was rare outside wealthy households. In smaller homes, the tub might even be placed near the hearth in the main room, turning bathing into a practical activity rather than a private ritual. Because of these difficulties, full baths were not a daily routine. In many places, they occurred only on special occasions, religious holidays, weddings, or seasonal festivals, sometimes provided the excuse for a thorough washing. During these moments, people might take the time to heat water, scrub their bodies carefully, and put on freshly cleaned linen garments. The process could feel almost ceremonial, marking an event that stood apart from ordinary life. For most of the year, however, people relied on simpler methods to stay reasonably clean. One of the most common practices was washing small parts of the body, rather than the entire person. A bowl of water and a cloth could be used to wipe the face, neck, hands, and sometimes the feet. This approach required far less water and fuel, and it could be done quickly before leaving for work. Farmers, laborers, and craftsmen often used damp cloths to remove sweat or dirt at the end of the day. The goal was not complete cleanliness, but simple comfort and social respectability. Linen undergarments also played an important role in everyday hygiene. Many medieval people wore a layer of linen clothing beneath their outer garments made from wool or heavier fabrics. Linen absorbs sweat and oils from the skin, acting almost like a filter between the body and the outer clothing. Because linen was lighter and easier to wash than wool, people could clean these undergarments more often than the clothing worn on top. By changing or washing linen pieces periodically, individuals managed to maintain a sense of freshness even without frequent baths. This system worked surprisingly well for the conditions of the time. When historians examine surviving texts and records, they often find that medieval people did care about cleanliness. They simply approached it differently from modern societies. Washing the hands, face, and linen garments regularly was considered sensible and respectable. Full water immersion was not always necessary to achieve what they considered an acceptable level of hygiene. From a modern perspective, the difference is striking. Today, bathing is effortless. A person turns a handle and clean water flows instantly. Heating systems provide warmth without effort, and soap products promise fragrances that last all day. The medieval world offered none of these conveniences. Clean water required labor, heat required fuel, and both were limited resources. In that environment, people adapted their expectations. Cleanliness became a matter of managing what was available rather than pursuing perfection. Social customs also reflected these realities. Visitors did not expect hosts to provide to bathing facilities, and neighbors rarely judged one another based on daily washing habits. Instead, appearance and clothing signaled whether someone cared for themselves properly. A person wearing reasonably clean linen and tidy hair was often considered respectable enough. The standards were practical and shaped by the environment people lived in. For peasants and laborers, the rhythm of life left little space for elaborate hygiene routines. Work began early in the morning and continued until daylight faded. Hands became rough from tools, soil, and animals. Bodies collected dust from roads and fields. Yet, these conditions were shared by nearly everyone in the community, which meant they felt ordinary rather than alarming. Cleanliness was measured relative to what others experienced, not against an ideal that no one could realistically achieve. Even within towns and villages, attitudes toward bathing varied depending on wealth and status. Wealthier households sometimes possessed larger tubs or servants who could help prepare bath water. In castles or noble homes, portable baths occasionally appeared in private chambers. These luxuries allowed the elite to wash more comfortably than ordinary villagers. Still, even among the wealthy, daily bathing was far from universal. The labor required to prepare hot water remained significant, regardless of status. Thinking about this world can feel unsettling today. It is easy to imagine the discomfort of wearing dusty clothes or going weeks without a full bath. Yet the people who lived through those centuries rarely described their lives in those terms. They focused instead on work, family, faith, and survival. Bathing was simply one small part of a much larger routine shaped by the limits of their technology and resources. The medieval approach to cleanliness reminds us that standards of hygiene are not fixed in time. They cheer, and alongside technology, economics, and cultural expectations, what feels unacceptable today may once have been perfectly normal. For the men and women of the Middle Ages, wiping the body with a damp cloth and changing linen garments was often enough to feel presentable in daily life. Life without regular bathing might seem surprising. Yet, it was a practical response to the limits of medieval technology and resources. But personal hygiene in the Middle Ages did not end with how people washed their bodies, because the places where people relieved themselves were often far more shocking than the absence of baths. Public bathing had once been far more common in medieval Europe than many people imagine today. In earlier centuries, particularly during the early Middle Ages, towns and cities across the continent maintained communal bathhouses that served an important social and practical function. These establishments were loosely inspired by the bathing traditions of the ancient Roman world, where bathing had been a central feature of urban life. Though the medieval versions were simpler and smaller, the idea remained similar. People gathered in shared spaces where heated water was available. Tubs or pools could be used, and the body could be washed more thoroughly than was possible inside most private homes. In many towns, these bathhouses stood near rivers or public wells where water could be drawn easily. Inside, large wooden tubs or stone basins were filled with water heated over fires in nearby furnaces. Visitors would pay a small fee, enter the bathing room, and spend time washing themselves with the help of attendants or family members. For travelers arriving from long journeys on dusty roads, the bathhouse offered relief that was difficult to find anywhere else. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers might stop by after long days of work, eager to rinse away sweat and grime that had collected beneath layers of wool clothing. The bathhouses were not only about hygiene, They also became social spaces where conversations flowed easily, and people gathered in a relaxed environment. Friends might visit together, neighbors might exchange news, and travelers might learn about events happening in the town. In some places, food and drink were even served nearby, turning the bathhouse into something resembling a small gathering place. The warm rooms filled with steam and the sound of splashing water created an atmosphere that felt welcoming compared to the cold streets outside. For a time, these establishments were accepted as a normal part of urban life. Town records from various parts of Europe mentioned bathhouses operating openly and legally. Owners paid taxes or licensing fees, and many communities depended on them as convenient places where people could wash properly. Because most homes lacked large tubs and sufficient heating, the bathhouse provided a service that individuals simply could not reproduce on their own. However, this acceptance did not last forever. Gradually, attitudes toward communal bathing began to change. One reason was the spread of disease during the later medieval centuries. Epidemics moved through crowded cities, leaving populations frightened and uncertain about what caused illness. Without scientific knowledge about bacteria or viruses, people tried to understand disease through observation and rumor. Some began to suspect that places where many bodies gathered together, especially warm and humid environments like bathhouses, might contribute to the spread of sickness. The fear intensified during periods of devastating epidemics that swept through Europe. Communities searched desperately for explanations. Since bathhouses brought strangers into close contact, they became easy targets for suspicion. Authority. Since certain towns began to question whether these establishments were safe for public health. Though there was little real evidence connecting them directly to outbreaks, the atmosphere of fear made many people cautious about entering them. At the same time, moral concerns started to influence opinions about bathhouses. Communal bathing involved people sharing spaces with minimal clothing, something that religious authorities in some regions began to view with discomfort. Critics argued that the environment of warm rooms, relaxed conversation, and mixed company might encourage behavior that was considered improper. Sermons and public warnings sometimes described bathhouses as places where discipline weakened and temptation could arise. These concerns slowly shifted the reputation of communal bathing. What had once been viewed as practical and harmless began to carry hints of danger or moral suspicion. Some bathhouses continued operating, but their numbers gradually declined. Town councils occasionally issued regulations limiting their activities or closing certain establishments altogether. In places where epidemics had struck particularly hard, the fear of disease alone was enough to convince communities to abandon them. As the bathhouses disappeared, people lost one of the few places where regular full bathing had been possible. Without these facilities, the task of washing the entire body became even more complicated. Private homes rarely had the space or resources to prepare large baths frequently. Water still had to be carried by hand, and heating it required valuable fuel. The convenience once provided by the public bathhouse could not easily be replaced. The change affected everyday life in subtle ways. When bathhouses were available, people could occasionally enjoy a proper wash without enormous effort. After their disappearance, such opportunities became rare. Many individuals returned entirely to simpler methods of hygiene, relying on cloth washing, changing linen garments, and occasional baths, prepared only during special occasions. Looking back from the modern world, the disappearance of these bathhouses seems almost ironic. Today, public facilities such as swimming pools, gyms, and spas are carefully regulated and considered beneficial for health and relaxation. Clean water systems and sanitation technologies make shared spaces far safer than they were centuries ago. In the medieval world, however, fear and uncertainty shaped decisions in ways that sometimes reduced access to cleanliness rather than improving it. The closing of bathhouses did not happen everywhere at the same moment, nor was it always permanent. Some regions continued to maintain bathing traditions longer than others. Yet across much of Europe, the general pattern was similar. Facilities that had once supported regular bathing slowly vanished from urban landscapes, leaving people with fewer options for keeping themselves fully clean. In quiet ways, this shift reshaped daily habits. Washing became something done in smaller steps rather than in complete immersion. Itched cloths, basins, and linen garments took the place of large communal baths. Medieval people adapted, as they always had, adjusting their routines to match the resources and beliefs surrounding them. The disappearance of public bathhouses quietly transformed how medieval people maintained cleanliness. Yet, losing these spaces did not remove the need for hygiene. It only forced people to find other solutions within their homes, because the simple piece of clothing worn closest to the skin would become one of the most important tools for staying clean. In a world where full baths had grown rare, clothing worn closest to the skin quietly became one of the most important tools for personal hygiene. In the medieval world, in a time when frequent bathing was difficult and public bathhouses were disappearing from many towns, people needed another way to manage sweat, dirt, and body odor. The solution was surprisingly simple. Beneath heavy wool garments, most medieval men and women wore a layer of linen clothing that acted almost like a barrier between the body and the outer layers of their attire. This linen undergarment was not meant to be seen by others. It remained hidden beneath tunics, dresses, and cloaks made from thicker fabrics. Yet, despite its invisible role, it served a practical purpose that was widely understood. Linen had a unique quality compared with wool or leather. It absorbed moisture from the skin far more effectively and could be washed more easily without losing its shape. Because of this, the linen layer quietly collected sweat and oils from the body throughout the day. For people who spent long hours working in fields, workshops, kitchens, or crowded streets, this layer became essential. Wool garments were expensive and difficult to clean. Washing them too often could damage the fabric and weaken the threads. As a result, the outer clothing of medieval people might be worn for long periods, with only occasional cleaning. The linen layer underneath solved this problem by taking the burden of daily contact with the body. At the end of a long day, when dust from roads and fields had settled into clothing, the linen undergarment carried much of that grime. It could then be removed and replaced with a cleaner one, if the household owned more than a single piece. Even when replacements were limited, the linen garment could be washed far more easily than wool, using water, simple soap made from ash or animal fat, and a hard scrubbing against wooden boards were often enough to clean it. This routine created a subtle system of hygiene that worked singly well for its time. Instead of bathing the entire body frequently, medieval people focused on cleaning the fabric that touched their skin. By removing the linen layer and washing it regularly, they prevented much of the sweat and odor from reaching the expensive outer garments. In this way, the linen acted almost like a filter that protected the clothing worn in public. It also helped maintain a sense of freshness that might otherwise have been difficult to achieve. Changing a linen garment could immediately make a person feel cleaner even without a full bath. The dry fabric against the skin replaced the dampness of the previous day, offering comfort after hours of work. For individuals who lived in environments where dust, smoke, and animal smells were constant companions, this simple change of clothing made a noticeable difference. Modern readers might be surprised by how carefully medieval societies valued linen for this purpose. Records from households, monasteries, and noble estates often mention the importance of maintaining sufficient linen supplies. Wealthier families sometimes owned several sets, allowing them to rotate garments more frequently. Servants or household members would wash and dry them regularly, ensuring that clean pieces were available when needed. For poorer families, the situation was more limited. They might own only 1 or 2 linen garments per person. Even so, the same principle applied. Washing the linen whenever possible helped preserve both comfort and cleanliness. A fresh linen shirt or smock could transform the feeling of wearing the same outer clothing day after day. The effort required to maintain these garments showed how seriously people took the challenge of personal hygiene. The process of washing linen was not easy work. Water had to be carried from wells or rivers, heated over fires, and poured into wooden tubs. Soap was, often rough and homemade, created from mixtures of animal fat and alkaline ash. Garments were soaked, scrubbed, and sometimes beaten against stones or boards to remove dirt. Afterward, they were hung in open air to dry, often catching sunlight and wind that helped remove lingering odor. Despite the labor involved, Many households considered this task worthwhile. Linen was durable enough to withstand repeated washing, which made it one of the most valuable materials for everyday clothing. Its role in hygiene became even more important after communal bathhouses declined. When full immersion baths became rarer, maintaining clean linen garments provided one of the most reliable ways to stay comfortable. Comparing the system to modern hygiene reveals how different daily life once was. Today, people often rely on showers, scented soaps, and deodorants to manage sweat and odor. Clothing is washed in machines that require little effort. In the medieval world, however, fabric itself carried much of the responsibility for cleanliness. The linen layer quietly performed the task that modern plumbing and detergents now handle. There is something unexpectedly practical in this arrangement. While the medieval world lacked modern sanitation, it still developed methods that addressed basic needs using available materials. Linen clothing became a simple but effective technology of personal care. By absorbing sweat and allowing regular washing, it created a balance between limited bathing opportunities and the desire to remain socially acceptable. For people walking through markets, attending church, or meeting neighbors, appearance still mattered. Clean linen signaled that someone took care of themselves, even in a challenging environment. A person whose undergarments were visibly dirty might be judged as careless or poor. In this way, linen served not only as protection against sweat, but also as a quiet marker of dignity. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was not entirely neglectful, as stereotypes sometimes suggest. Instead, it relied on strategies adapted to the realities of the time. Linen clothing provided one of the most important of those strategies. It allowed people to maintain a degree of cleanliness, even when water, fuel, and bathing facilities were scarce. The layer of cloth hidden beneath heavy garments carries more responsibility than it first appears. It protected expensive clothing, absorbed sweat, and offered comfort in environments where bathing was rare. Through this quiet role, linen helped medieval people navigate daily life in a world where hygiene required patience and practical thinking. The linen layer, worn beneath medieval clothing, quietly absorbed sweat and dirt, acting as a simple but effective barrier between the body and expensive outer garments. Yet clothing alone could not solve every challenge of cleanliness in medieval life. The places where people relieved themselves were often crude structures built directly into castle walls, and the reality of those toilets would shock most modern visitors the moment they saw them. To understand medieval hygiene fully, it is necessary to look at a part of daily life that people rarely spoke about openly, but experienced every single day. In castles, towns, and even simple homes, the question of where human waste went was solved in ways that would feel startling to modern visitors. The medieval toilet was not a separate room with porcelain fixtures and running water. Instead, it was often a small stone space built directly into the wall of a fortress or tower, designed with one simple purpose. This structure was known as the garderobe. At first glance, the garderobe might appear surprisingly small. It was usually a narrow chamber built into the thick outer walls of a castle. Inside, there might be a wooden seat or simply a stone slab, with a circular hole cut through the center. Beneath that hole was an open vertical shaft. When someone used the toilet, waste fell directly down this shaft and out through the outer wall of the building. Gravity handled the rest of the process. The destination of that waste varied depending on the design of the castle. In many fortresses, the shaft opened above a moat, allowing the contents to drop straight into the water below. In other cases, it fell onto the ground outside the castle walls, often collecting in pits or open areas that needed occasional clearing. The system required almost no plumbing, no pipes, and no complicated engineering. It relied entirely on the simple fact that what goes down must eventually land somewhere below. From a practical standpoint, the design had advantages. It removed waste from the living areas of the castle quickly and required little maintenance compared to more complex systems. Medieval builders valued solutions that were durable and simple. Thick stone walls could easily hide narrow shafts, and the structure could last for generations without needing major repairs. For the people who lived inside these castles, The garderobe was simply part of the architecture. Yet, the experience of using such a toilet was very different from what modern people expect. The small chamber often had only a narrow slit window for ventilation. Cold air drifted through the opening, and the smell from the shaft below could rise upward depending on the wind. During warmer months, the odor could become particularly strong, even in large castles where multiple garderobes existed. The area around them was rarely pleasant. Servants and castle workers understood this reality well. They often avoided lingering near these spaces longer than necessary. In some castles, guards or attendants were assigned the unpleasant task of clearing waste that collected outside the walls or in pits beneath the shafts. This work was dirty, exhausting, and considered one of the least desirable responsibilities in the entire household. Despite these conditions, the garderobe represented a surprisingly thoughtful solution for its time. Many castles placed these toilets along outer walls so that waste would be carried away from the main living quarters. Some designs positioned them above flowing water or streams whenever possible. Others extended the shafts far enough downward that smells and insects were less likely to travel upward into the building. In towns and smaller buildings, the situation could be even less comfortable. Not every structure had the thick stone walls needed to support a built-in garderobe. In those places, people often relied on simple latrines, placed behind buildings or over small pits dug into the ground. These pits collected waste over time until they were eventually emptied or covered. The process of cleaning them was unpleasant and rarely discussed openly, but it was necessary for the functioning of the community. Comparing this system with modern sanitation highlights how dramatically technology has changed everyday life. Today, toilets connect to pipes that carry waste far away from homes through underground sewer networks. Water flushes the bowl instantly, removing both waste and odor within seconds. In the medieval world, none of these conveniences existed. Waste disposal depended on gravity, open air, and the occasional labor of workers who had to deal with the results. The sensory experience of medieval castles must have been very different from what modern visitors imagine when they admire the impressive stone walls and towering battlements. Behind the grand halls and decorated chambers were these small, narrow toilet rooms, duty directly into the structure. The practical needs of life existed alongside the symbols of power and wealth. One detail often surprises modern observers when they learn about garderobes. Some historians believe that the name itself may come from the French words meaning to guard clothing. In certain castles, people occasionally hung garments in these small rooms because the constant airflow through the shaft helped keep moths away. While this may sound unusual today, it shows how people adapted to the conditions surrounding them in practical ways. Even with these adaptations, the overall environment around medieval toilets remained far from comfortable. The smell, the open shafts, and the constant awareness of waste falling beneath the castle walls created a reality that few modern people would willingly accept. Yet, for centuries, this was simply how sanitation worked inside some of the most powerful buildings in Europe. Medieval society was accustomed to living closer to the realities of waste, dirt, and smell than modern societies are today. Without modern plumbing or sanitation systems, communities relied on methods that balanced practicality with available technology. The garderobe represented one such solution, simple and effective, but far removed from the expectations of the modern world. Over time, these systems became so normal that people barely thought about them. Nobles, servants, guards, and visitors all used them as part of their daily routine. The design was not hidden or secret. It was simply part of the castle's structure, built into the walls, just like staircases and windows. Medieval castles solved the problem of human waste with simple structures built directly into their thick stone walls. Yet, these private castle toilets were only one part of the sanitation story in the Middle Ages. In crowded towns, where many families shared the same spa, the experience of using the toilet could become even more uncomfortable and far more chaotic. Life inside medieval towns was crowded in ways that are difficult to imagine today. Narrow streets twisted between rows of timber houses. Upper floors leaned outward over the roads, and families lived close together in buildings that often held far more people than they were originally designed for. In such environments, the question of sanitation was not solved by private facilities. Most homes simply did not have the space or structure to support their own latrines. Instead, the solution was shared. Entire groups of households relied on a single communal toilet located somewhere nearby. These shared latrines were usually placed at the edge of a courtyard or at the far end of an alley. In many neighborhoods, they stood behind the houses, tucked away where they would cause the least disruption to daily life. Sometimes they were small wooden huts built above pits dug into the ground. Other times they were simple stone structures connected to shallow channels that carried waste away from the buildings. Their appearance varied widely from town to town, depending on local customs and the materials available. For the families who lived around them, these communal toilets became a regular part of their daily routine. People walked to them several times a day, often carrying small containers of water or cloths for cleaning. Children learned early where these structures stood and how to use them properly. Because so many people depended on the same facility, timing mattered. Early morning and evening were often the busiest hours, when neighbors might quietly queue outside, waiting for their turn. Unlike the private garderobies found in castles, these shared toilets required cooperation among the residents who used them. Their cleanliness depended entirely on the habits of the community. If the neighbors worked together to maintain them, the structures could remain reasonably usable. Waste pits might be cleared periodically, and wooden seats or walls might be repaired when they began to decay. In neighborhoods where people were careful, the latrine could function as a simple but effective system. However, such cooperation was not always guaranteed. Medieval towns were busy places filled with traders, laborers, apprentices, and travelers passing through. Not everyone felt responsible for maintaining shared spaces. When a latrine was neglected, the results quickly became unpleasant. Waste could accumulate faster than it was removed. Wooden structures could rot, and the surrounding ground could become damp and foul-smelling. In narrow courtyards where airflow was limited, odor could linger heavily in the air. The challenge of maintaining these shared toilets became especially difficult in densely populated districts. As towns grew larger during the later Middle Ages, more families crowded into the same spaces. Houses were divided into smaller rooms to accommodate tenants, and entire families might live within a single floor of a building. Yet the number of sanitation facilities rarely increased at the same pace as the population. One communal latrine might serve dozens of people, all relying on the same simple structure. Under such conditions, hygiene varied greatly from place to place. In some neighborhoods, residents organized regular cleaning efforts. Waste pits were emptied by workers who carried the material away to dumping grounds outside the city walls. These unpleasant but necessary jobs were performed by laborers, whose work rarely appeared in official records, but was essential to keeping towns livable. Without their efforts, the accumulation of waste would have quickly overwhelmed urban spaces. In other neighborhoods, however, the situation could deteriorate rapidly if pits were not emptied in time, or if structures were poorly maintained. The area around the latrine could become one of the least pleasant parts of the town. Mud, waste, and stagnant water might mix after rainfall. Flies and insects gathered easily in such conditions, particularly during warm months. Residents who lived nearby often had little choice but to tolerate the smells drifting through their windows. Modern readers often find these descriptions disturbing, but it is important to remember that medieval people were accustomed to living much closer to the realities of waste than modern societies are. Without underground sewer systems or running water, every community had to find its own practical solution. Shared latrines represented one of the simplest ways to manage sanitation in crowded environments. At the same time, people did not completely ignore the problem. Town authorities sometimes issued rules about where latrines could be built and how waste should be removed. Certain areas were designated for dumping waste outside the city walls. In some places, fines were imposed on residents who allowed refuse or waste to accumulate dangerously. Enforcement was not always consistent, but these efforts show that medieval communities understood the importance of managing sanitation as best they could. The experience of using a communal toilet must have been very different from the privacy modern people expect today. The structures were small, often dimly lit, and rarely designed with comfort in mind. Yet, they served a necessary purpose for thousands of people who lived within the crowded streets of medieval towns. Without them, daily life in these communities would have been even more difficult. Looking back, the system reveals how medieval society balanced practicality with limited technology. Shared facilities allowed entire neighborhoods to function despite the absence of plumbing. They were imperfect solutions shaped by the materials, knowledge, and resources available at the time. For the people who used them every day, they were simply part of ordinary urban life. Even so, communal toilets were only one part of the broader challenge of hygiene. After using these facilities, people still faced the question of how to clean themselves. In a world without modern toilet paper, individuals relied on a surprising variety of materials to solve that final problem of sanitation. Shared latrines allowed crowded medieval neighborhoods to function, despite the absence of private toilets. Yet the challenge of sanitation did not end once people left those structures. The real surprise for modern readers comes when we discover what people actually used instead of toilet paper. One of the most ordinary objects in modern bathrooms would have been completely unfamiliar to people living in the Middle Ages. The soft roll of toilet paper that sits beside the toilet today did not exist in medieval Europe. In fact, the very idea of a standardized disposable product used for personal cleaning was still centuries away. Yet, people still had to solve the same problem that every human being faces. After using a latrine or communal toilet, they needed some way to clean themselves. The solutions were simple, practical, and shaped by whatever materials were easy to find nearby. Instead of a manufactured product, medieval people relied on objects that were already part of everyday life. These items varied depending on region, social class, and environment, but the principle was always the same. People used what was available, what was cheap, and what could be replaced easily. One of the most common materials was dry straw. In rural communities where farming dominated daily life, straw was everywhere. It filled mattresses, lay in elemental stalls, and remained scattered across barns and courtyards after harvest seasons. Its rough texture made it suitable for wiping, and it could be discarded immediately afterward. For farmers and villagers, grabbing a handful of straw from a nearby pile was often the easiest solution. Leaves also served a similar purpose, especially during warmer months. Trees and plants provided an endless supply of soft foliage that could be collected quickly. In forested areas, people sometimes preferred broad leaves that offered better coverage and comfort. The practice required little preparation. A person could simply step outside, gather a few leaves, and use them before returning to daily tasks. Nature itself provided the material needed for this most private routine. Another method involved the use of cloth. Old pieces of fabric that were too worn for clothing was sometimes repurposed for cleaning. These scraps could be washed and reused repeatedly. In households where linen or other fabrics were already part of daily life, keeping a few cloths nearby for sanitation purposes was practical. After use, the cloth could be rinsed in water and cleaned along with other household textiles. Water itself sometimes replaced wiping altogether. In certain situations, people simply washed the area with water instead of using dry materials. This method required access to a bucket, basin, or nearby stream, but it was effective and familiar in many cultures. Carrying a small container of water to a latrine was not uncommon, particularly in towns where communal facilities were used by many residents throughout the day. From a modern perspective, these methods might appear uncomfortable or primitive, yet they reflected a straightforward approach to daily hygiene. Medieval people did not view these practices as unusual. They were simply the logical solutions available within the limits of their environment. Manufactured paper products had not yet become widespread, and even if they had existed, the cost would likely have placed them far beyond the reach of most families. The absence of toilet paper reminds us how different the material culture of the medieval world was from our own. Today, entire industries produce specialized products designed for convenience and comfort. Packaging, softness, and scent are carefully engineered. In contrast, medieval societies relied almost entirely on natural materials and reusable household items. The goal was not luxury, but practicality. These practices also highlight how closely medieval life remained connected to the surrounding landscape. Fields, forests, and gardens supplied many of the materials needed for daily routines. A pile of straw, a handful of leaves, or a piece of cloth could all serve the same purpose without requiring factories or trade networks. In this sense, sanitation depended as much on the natural environment as it did on human ingenuity. It is important to note that these methods were not always perfectly hygienic by modern standards. Rough materials could irritate the skin, and reused cloth required careful washing to remain clean. Yet, medieval people adapted their habits in ways that balanced comfort with practicality. Over time, these routines became normal parts of daily life, passed down from one generation to the next. Even within the same town, practices could vary widely. Wealthier households might keep small cloths specifically for personal cleaning, while poorer families relied almost entirely on whatever materials they could gather outdoors. Travelers often had to improvise using whatever resources were available along the road. The diversity of these methods reflected the flexible nature of medieval hygiene. Modern readers often imagine medieval sanitation as entirely chaotic, but the reality was more nuanced. People understood the importance of cleaning themselves after using the toilet. They simply achieved this goal through materials that were familiar and readily available rather than manufactured products. The absence of toilet paper did not mean the absence of hygiene. It meant that hygiene followed a different set of tools. Thinking about this difference can be surprisingly revealing. It shows how something as ordinary as a bathroom routine is shaped by technology, trade, and cultural expectations. The modern bathroom represents centuries of development in manufacturing, plumbing, and public health. Medieval people lived at an earlier stage of that history, relying on natural materials and simple solutions. Even so, sanitation involved more than personal habits alone. The larger environment surrounding towns and villages played a powerful role in shaping daily life. Clean water was not always easy to find, and the condition of local wells, rivers, and streams could influence everything from cooking to hygiene. Medieval people used straw, leaves, cloth, or water to solve the simple problem of cleaning themselves in a world without toilet paper. Yet personal habits alone could not guarantee cleanliness in everyday life. A deeper problem appeared when the water people relied on for drinking and washing was sometimes polluted by the very waste they were trying to escape. Clean water, something most people today can obtain by turning a simple handle, was never guaranteed in the towns and villages of the Middle Ages. Every drop had to be found, carried, and protected carefully. Without pipes, pumps, or filtration systems, medieval communities depended entirely on natural sources. Wells dug into the ground, streams flowing through valleys, and rivers running beside city walls provided the water that people needed for drinking, cooking, and washing. Yet, these same sources often carried dangers that were not immediately visible. In many medieval towns, the well stood at the center of daily life. It might be located in a courtyard, a market square, or along the busy street where residents gathered each morning. People arrived carrying wooden buckets, clay jugs, or metal pails. Drawing water required physical effort. A rope had to be lowered, a bucket filled, and the weight lifted carefully back to the surface. For households that needed several containers each day, the process repeated again and again. These wells were essential, yet they were also vulnerable. Unlike modern wells protected by sealed systems, medieval ones were often exposed to whatever entered the surrounding ground. Rainwater washed soil and debris toward them. Waste pits located nearby sometimes leaked into the earth. When animals wandered too close, their droppings could contaminate the area around the well. Even a small amount of pollution could affect the water drawn from below. Rivers and streams offered another important supply, particularly for larger towns built near flowing water. These waterways provided large quantities of water that could be collected quickly. People filled buckets along the riverbanks or carried water back from nearby bridges. At first glance, moving water seemed cleaner than standing water. Yet rivers were rarely used only for drinking. They also served as places where laundry was washed, animals drank, and waste from houses or workshops was sometimes discarded. This mixture of uses created a complicated situation. A river that looked clear might still carry unseen impurities from upstream settlements. When towns grew larger and industries expanded, the problem became even more noticeable. Tanneries, dye workshops, and slaughterhouses occasionally released waste into the same water that residents relied upon for daily needs. Without an understanding of microscopic organisms or chemical pollution, people could not always recognize the risks hidden within these waters. The consequences sometimes appeared gradually. Individuals might become sick after drinking contaminated water, yet the cause was rarely obvious. Illness could spread quietly through households and neighborhoods before anyone realized the connection. Medieval people did not understand bacteria or viruses, so they explained disease through other ideas. Many believed that harmful vapors or foul smells carried sickness rather than invisible organisms in water. Despite these uncertainties, communities still depended on the same sources every day. Water remained necessary for cooking meals, brewing drinks, and washing clothing. Even when people suspected that a river or well was not perfectly clean, they often had few alternatives. Carrying water from distant springs required long journeys, and not every settlement had access to such sources. The difficulty of obtaining clean water affected personal hygiene in subtle but important ways. Bathing already required large quantities of heated water, which meant people were cautious about using it unnecessarily. When the quality of available water was uncertain, the incentive to conserve it grew even stronger. Households preferred to reserve water for drinking and cooking rather than for full baths. As a result, the routines described in earlier parts of this story became even more important. Washing small parts of the body, cleaning linen garments, and using cloths to wipe the skin allowed people to maintain some level of hygiene without consuming too much water. These habits were not merely traditions. They were practical adaptations to the realities of living in environments where water could not be wasted. Some towns attempted to improve their water systems through basic engineering. Wooden pipes or channels occasionally directed water from distant springs toward public fountains. In a few places, these systems reduced the effort required to collect water. However, such improvements remained limited and often fragile. Pipes could break, channels could become blocked, and maintenance required constant attention. For most residents, daily life continued to revolve around wells and rivers. Early mornings might begin with the sound of buckets scraping against stone as neighbors gathered to draw water. Children carried smaller containers home while adults balanced heavy loads across their shoulders. These routines were repeated every day, shaping the rhythm of medieval communities. Looking back from the modern world, it is easy to underestimate how central water was to survival. Today, clean water appears instantly in kitchens and bathrooms, treated and transported through complex infrastructure. In the Middle Ages, obtaining it required cooperation, effort, and sometimes luck. A polluted well or a contaminated river could disrupt the life of an entire neighborhood. The scarcity and uncertainty of clean water remind us that medieval hygiene was shaped by environmental limits as much as by cultural habits. People did not ignore cleanliness. Instead, they navigated the challenges presented by the resources available to them. Their methods may appear imperfect today, but they represented practical solutions within a very different technological landscape. Understanding this challenge helps explain why certain smells and conditions became familiar parts of medieval urban life. When water supplies were uncertain and sanitation systems were simple, towns developed distinctive environments that modern visitors might find overwhelming. Access to water determined how people cooked, washed, and tried to stay clean in medieval towns. Yet the difficulty of finding truly clean water was only one reason medieval cities had such powerful smells. Streets filled with animals, markets, and waste created an atmosphere that modern visitors would find almost unbearable. Walking into a medieval city would have been an experience unlike anything most modern visitors could imagine. Long before one saw the towers, market stalls, or crowded houses, the first thing that announced the presence of the town was often its smell. The air itself carried a mixture of scents that drifted through narrow streets and between tightly packed buildings. For people living in the Middle Ages, this mixture was simply part of daily life. For a traveler arriving from the countryside, it could be overwhelming. Medieval streets were rarely clean in the modern sense of the word. Most roads were made from packed earth or uneven stone, and they collected everything that passed over them. Horses, carts, and livestock moved through the streets from early morning until nightfall. Each animal left behind waste that mixed with mud and rainwater. Over time, the ground became a thick blend of soil, manure, and debris that clung to boots and wagon wheels. The rain only made the situation more complicated. Instead of washing the streets clean, heavy showers often turned the ground into a thick, slippery surface. Mud absorbed whatever waste lay on the road, trapping smells that lingered long after the rain stopped. When the weather warmed again, the sun released those odors back into the air. The result was a scent that seemed to hover permanently over many busy neighborhoods. Markets added their own powerful contribution to the atmosphere. Medieval markets were lively places filled with traders selling vegetables, grain, fish, and meat. Farmers arrived with carts of produce from nearby villages, while fishermen carried baskets filled with the day's care. But not everything sold in the market disappeared immediately. Leftover scraps of food sometimes fell to the ground and remained there until someone swept them away. Fish stalls, in particular, were known for their strong scent. Fresh fish already carried a noticeable smell, and as the day progressed, the odor grew heavier in the warmth of the afternoon sun. Nearby meat vendors displayed cuts of pork, beef, and mutton on wooden tables. Blood and fat occasionally dripped onto the ground beneath the stalls. Even when sellers tried to keep their areas clean, traces of these materials often remained. Slaughterhouses produced another layer of smell within the city. Animals brought into town for processing were killed and prepared in specialized areas where butchers worked throughout the day. The process created waste that had to be removed or discarded somewhere nearby. Although some cities attempted to regulate where slaughterhouses could operate, the scent of these places still drifted through surrounding streets. Outdoor cooking added yet another element to the mixture. Many medieval households prepared meals over open fires or small kitchen hearths that vented smoke directly into the air. Vendors in busy markets sometimes cooked food outside, roasting meat or baking bread where customers could see the process. The aroma of cooking could be pleasant on its own, but when combined with the other smells of the city, it became part of a much more complex atmosphere. Garbage also played a role in shaping the scent of medieval towns. Without organized waste collection systems, households often disposed of scraps and refuse in nearby areas or simple pits. Some towns created dumping grounds outside their walls, but smaller amounts of waste still accumulated within neighborhoods. Bits of food, broken objects, and animal remains could remain in the corners of streets until some eon removed them. All of these elements blended in the confined spaces of medieval urban design. Houses were built close together, and upper floors sometimes extended outward over the street below. This architecture created narrow passages where air circulated slowly. Instead of quickly dispersing unpleasant smells, the tight layout allowed them to linger. For people who lived in these towns every day, however, the experience was very different from what a modern visitor might feel. Human senses adapt quickly to familiar environments. Residents who grew up surrounded by these smells often noticed them far less than outsiders did. The scent of the market, the animals, and the streets became part of the background of daily life. Travelers occasionally wrote about the contrast when they entered large cities after spending time in rural areas. The sudden concentration of people, animals, and activity created an atmosphere that seemed intense at first. Yet, even these visitors usually adjusted after a short time. Once the smells became familiar, they faded into the ordinary rhythm of city life. The presence of these odors also reminds us that medieval cities were vibrant, active places rather than quiet museum pieces. Every smell represented some part of the economy or daily routine. Animals transported goods, markets supplied food, and workshops produced materials needed for trade. The mixture of scents was the byproduct of a society working, trading, and surviving within its physical limits. Modern sanitation systems and waste management have dramatically changed how cities smell today. Sewers carry waste away through underground pipes. Garbage is collected regularly, and strict regulations control food preparation. In the Middle Ages, none of these systems existed. Urban life operated through simpler methods that inevitably left their mark on the environment. Understanding the smell of medieval cities helps paint a more realistic picture of everyday life in that era. Behind the castles, cathedrals, and grand halls often highlighted in history books was a living city full of ordinary human activity. The scents drifting through its streets were as much a part of the landscape as the buildings themselves. Yet, medieval people did not simply accept unpleasant odors without response. Over time, they developed their own ways of coping with the environment around them. One of the most common solutions involved carrying pleasant scents that could mask the smells of crowded streets and busy markets. Medieval cities were filled with the smells of animals, markets, cooking fires, and crowded streets. Yet, people living in these environments did not simply endure the odors without trying to improve their surroundings. Many began carrying small bundles of fragrant plants and herbs to protect themselves from the overwhelming scents of daily life. In a world where the air of cities often carried the smell of animals, smoke, and crowded streets, medieval people developed their own quiet strategies to remain comfortable in public spaces. Without modern perfumes, deodorants, or scented soaps, one of the simplest solutions was found in nature itself. Plants with strong and pleasant aromas became valuable tools in daily life. Many individuals carried small bundles of herbs or dried flowers with them, using these natural scents to soften the harsher smells that surrounded them. These fragrant bundles were often called herb sachets or small scent bags. They were simple objects, sometimes nothing more than a small cloth pouch tied with a cord. Inside the pouch were dried leaves, petals, or aromatic stems gathered from gardens and nearby fields. When carried in a pocket, hung from a belt, or tucked inside clothing, the herbs slowly released their scent. Rough out the day. Among the most popular plants used for this purpose were rosemary and lavender. Both were widely known in medieval Europe for their strong and pleasant fragrance. Rosemary grew easily in many regions and was valued not only for its scent, but also for its association with freshness and cleanliness. Lavender, with its gentle floral aroma, was equally admired and often dried carefully so that its scent would last for months. People believed these herbs did more than simply smell pleasant. Many thought that strong natural fragrances could protect them from harmful vapors in the air. Medieval medicine often described disease as something carried by foul smells or corrupted air. According to this belief, breathing pleasant scents could help guard the body from illness. Carrying fragrant herbs, therefore, served both a practical and symbolic purpose. The practice of using herbs to improve personal scent was not limited to the wealthy. While nobles might have access to imported perfumes or expensive oils, ordinary people relied on plants they could gather or grow themselves. Rosemary bushes and lavender patches were common in many gardens, and wild herbs could be collected along roadsides or fields. Preparing a sachet required little effort, making it accessible to nearly everyone. In crowded towns, these small bundles of fragrance became particularly useful. Walking through busy markets or narrow streets meant encountering a mixture of smells from animals, cooking fires, and waste. Holding a scented herb pouch near the nose could make such environments more tolerable. Even a faint scent of lavender or rosemary could soften the stronger odors drifting through the air. Herbs were also placed inside clothing and bedding. Dried plants were sometimes scattered among stored garments to keep fabrics smelling fresh. Linen chests might contain small bundles of herbs, tucked between folded clothing. This practice helped maintain a sense of cleanliness, even when washing opportunities were limited. Bedrooms often benefited from these natural fragrances as well. Medieval mattresses were frequently filled with straw or other plant materials that could trap odors over time. By adding aromatic herbs to bedding, households created a more pleasant environment for sleep. The scent released slowly during the night, giving the room a feeling of freshness. These habits reveal an interesting balance within medieval hygiene practices. People understood that strong odors could be unpleasant or even unhealthy, yet they lacked the chemical products that modern societies rely upon. Instead, They turned to the resources provided by their surroundings. Plants offered a natural way to improve the atmosphere of homes, clothing, and crowded streets. The use of herbs also connected medieval hygiene with the rhythms of the seasons. Fresh plants were gathered in spring and summer, then dried carefully for use during colder months. Bundles hung from beams or rafters where air could circulate around them. Over time, these drying herbs filled homes with subtle fragrance even before they were used. From a modern perspective, this reliance on plants might seem modest compared with the powerful fragrances found in contemporary perfumes and cleaning products. Yet the medieval approach carried its own quiet practicality. The scents were gentle rather than overwhelming, and they blended naturally with the environment rather than trying to overpower it. Travelers moving through towns might notice these herbal aromas drifting faintly from doorways or clothing. The scent of rosemary or lavender could mingle with the smell of bread, baking, or wood smoke rising from hearth. These subtle fragrances helped soften the harsher aspects of urban life and gave medieval communities their own distinctive atmosphere. In many ways, these practices demonstrate how medieval people adapted creatively to the challenges of their environment. Without access to modern hygiene products, they developed methods that used simple natural materials. Herbs offered an affordable way to maintain comfort and dignity even when surrounding conditions were less than ideal. The habit of carrying fragrant plants persisted for centuries and influenced later traditions of perfumery and scented goods. Over time, herbal oils and distilled fragrances became more refined, eventually leading to the perfumes and deodorants familiar today. Yet the roots of these products can be traced back to those simple sachets of dried herbs carried quietly through medieval streets. Even with these fragrant solutions, however, medieval people still faced other challenges in maintaining personal cleanliness. Pleasant scents could mask odors temporarily, but they could not remove every problem associated with daily hygiene. Another important part of personal care involved the maintenance of hair and facial hair, which required its own set of skills and services. Fragrant herbs allowed medieval people to soften the odors of crowded streets and busy homes. Yet, pleasant scents alone could not solve every challenge of personal appearance. The responsibility for keeping hair and beards neat often fell to a surprising place that served as both a grooming shop and a small medical clinic. Personal appearance in the Middle Ages was influenced by more than clothing and cleanliness. Hair and beards also played an important role in how individuals were perceived within their communities. In towns and cities, men who wished to maintain a respectable appearance often relied on the services of barbers. These establishments were far more than simple hair-cutting shops. They were places where grooming, healthcare, and social interaction came together in ways that might surprise modern observers. Barber shops were commonly found along busy streets or near market areas where foot traffic was constant. The interior of such a place was usually modest. A wooden chair, a table for tools, and perhaps a basin for washing were often enough to conduct the work of the day. Barbers kept simple instruments such as razors, scissors, and combs ready for their customers. These tools might be sharpened each morning carefully before the first visitor arrived. Men visited barbers for a variety of grooming tasks. Cutting hair was one of the most common services. Medieval hairstyles were often practical rather than decorative, and keeping hair trimmed helped maintain a neat appearance. A shorter style also made it easier to manage hair beneath hats or helmets, which were worn frequently by soldiers, travelers, and workers. Shaving beards was another important task. Facial hairstyles varied, depending on region and social customs, but many men preferred to keep their beards trimmed or removed entirely. Shaving with a straight razor required skill and a steady hand. Attempting the task alone could easily result in cuts or irritation. For that reason, visiting a barber was often the safer and more comfortable choice. The barber's role, however, extended well beyond simple grooming. In medieval society, barbers frequently served as providers of basic medical services. This dual profession developed partly because the tools used for shaving resembled those needed for minor medical procedures. Over time, barbers became known as individuals capable of performing tasks such as treating wounds, extracting teeth, and performing a procedure known as bloodletting. Bloodletting was based on the medical belief that illness resulted from an imbalance of bodily fluids. By removing a small quantity of blood, practitioners believed they could restore balance within the body. Barbers used special knives or lancets to carry out this procedure, often in the same chair where haircuts were given. While modern medicine no longer follows these practices, they were widely accepted during the medieval period. Because of these combined roles, the barber shop became an important gathering place within the community. Men visited not only to cut their hair or shave, but also to seek advice or treatment for minor ailments. Conversations often filled the room while customers waited for their turn. News from nearby villages, traveling merchants, or distant regions might circulate through these casual discussions. Maintaining neat hair and facial hair carried social meaning. A well-groomed appearance suggested discipline and self-respect. In busy towns where many individuals lived close together, visible signs of care for one's appearance helped communicate reliability and order. A man who allowed his hair to grow wild or his beard to become tangled might be viewed as careless or lacking in respect for others. This expectation did not mean that every individual visited the barber regularly. For poorer laborers or farmers living far from towns, opportunities to seek professional grooming were limited. Some individuals trimmed their own hair using simple knives or scissors available at home. Even in these cases, however, the goal remained similar. People generally preferred to keep their hair manageable rather than letting it grow without control. Barbers also played a role during special occasions. Before religious celebrations, weddings, or important gatherings, men might visit the shop to prepare themselves properly. A fresh haircut or careful shave created a sense of readiness for events that carried social significance. In this way, grooming became connected not only with hygiene, but also with ritual and public life. The barber's profession continued to evolve over the centuries. In later periods, the distinctive barber pole became a symbol of the trade. Its red and white stripes represented the historical connection between barbers and bloodletting procedures. Although modern barbers no longer perform medical treatments, the symbol remains a reminder of how closely grooming and medicine were once linked. Thinking about these barber shops helps us understand how medieval communities managed personal care in a world without modern beauty salons or medical clinics. The barber served multiple roles at once. He cut hair, shaved beards, treated minor injuries, and provided a place where people could gather and exchange information. His shop represented a small but important part of everyday life in medieval towns. The emphasis on grooming also shows that medieval societies cared deeply about appearance. Even when resources were limited and bathing opportunities were rare, people still valued signs of order and cleanliness. A neatly trimmed beard or properly cut hair communicated respect for oneself and for the community. From the perspective of modern life, the idea of receiving a haircut and a medical procedure in the same chair might seem unusual. Yet for medieval people, this combination made practical sense. Skilled hands capable of handling sharp tools could be trusted for multiple tasks. In a time when specialized professions were less common, versatility was a valuable quality. These grooming practices formed only one part of a larger pattern of everyday hygiene. Clean hands, for example, were considered especially important in another context that shaped daily life. The shared experience of eating together, keeping hair and beards neat, helped medieval men maintain a respectable appearance within their communities. Yet, grooming alone could not ensure cleanliness during daily routines. A person's hygiene became most visible at the table, where everyone could see whether their hands had been washed before touching the food. Eating in the Middle Ages was a far more physical experience than most modern meals. Forks were rare in many regions, and knives were often shared between diners. Bread served as both food and ute. And seal used to scoop meat sauces and vegetables directly from communal dishes. In such a setting, hands were the primary tools at the table. Because of this, the simple act of washing them before a meal carried greater importance than many people today might expect.
Before food was served, it was common for water to be brought to the table so that guests could clean their hands.
A servant or household member would carry a basin filled with water, sometimes accompanied by a small pitcher used to pour water over each person's fingers. Diners would hold their hands over the basin while the water ran across their skin, washing away dust, sweat, or dirt collected during the day. This ritual appeared in homes of different social levels, though the details varied depending on wealth and setting. In noble households, The process could be surprisingly formal. Decorative basins made from metal or glazed pottery were placed before the guests. Servants poured water slowly from elegant pitchers, while guests washed their hands carefully. The act was not rushed. It was part of the rhythm of the meal itself, signaling that the gathering was about to begin. Among ordinary households, the process was simpler, but followed the same idea. A wooden bowl or basin filled with water might be passed from one person to another. Each diner dipped their hands or rinsed their fingers before the food arrived. Even when resources were limited, this brief washing remained an important gesture of courtesy. Clean hands were not only about hygiene, they also reflected social respect. Sharing food meant that everyone's hands would touch the same dishes, bread, and serving surfaces. If a person's hands were visibly dirty, it would affect the entire meal. Washing before eating, therefore, showed consideration for others at the table. It demonstrated awareness that one's actions could influence the comfort of the group. Medieval etiquette texts sometimes emphasized this point directly. Guests were expected to arrive at meals with clean hands and trimmed nails whenever possible. If someone came from work or travel, rinsing their hands before eating became even more important. In a world without disposable utensils or personal plates for every diner, this small habit helped maintain a basic level of cleanliness during communal meals. After washing, diners usually dried their hands using cloth towels. Unlike modern households where each person might have their own towel, medieval meals often involved a shared cloth. A long piece of linen might be draped across the table or handed from one person to another. Each guest wiped their hands briefly before passing the cloth along to the next person. To modern readers, this might seem unhygienic. Yet, within the context of the time, it was a practical compromise. The cloth was usually clean at the start of the meal and served only for drying already washed hands. Its shared use reflected the communal nature of medieval dining. Meals were not individual experiences, but collective gatherings where many resources were shared. The washing ritual also helped mark the transition between daily work and the act of eating. Medieval life involved constant contact with physical labor. Farmers handled soil, craftsmen worked with tools and materials, and merchants traveled dusty roads. Arriving at the table meant leaving those activities behind for a short time. Washing the hands symbolically removed the traces of work before the meal began. In wealthier settings, the ritual could appear almost ceremonial. Guests might stand beside the table, while servants presented basins and towels. Once everyone had washed, the meal could officially start. This moment created a pause that brought attention to the importance of shared dining. Even though washing itself was simple, the act carried social meaning. These customs also reveal something about how medieval people understood cleanliness. While they lacked knowledge of microscopic germs, they clearly recognized that visible dirt should not enter the food shared by many people. The practice of washing hands before meals reflected practical observation. Clean hands made eating more pleasant and reduced the spread of obvious contamination. Travelers and visitors often adapted quickly to these customs. When entering a household for a meal, they followed the same routine as the host family. Accepting the basin and washing one's hands became a polite gesture that acknowledged the hospitality of the host. Refusing such a ritual might be considered disrespectful. Looking at these traditions today highlights how much dining habits have changed. Modern meals rely heavily on utensils that separate hands from food. Individual plates, forks, and spoons reduce the need for shared contact with dishes. In the medieval world, however, the absence of these tools made hand washing far more essential. The ritual reminds us that hygiene in the Middle Ages did not disappear simply because modern sanitation systems had not yet developed. Instead, people created customs that addressed the practical challenges they faced. Washing hands before meals was one of the most visible examples of this effort. Even with such practices, however, medieval homes and streets still faced other challenges that influenced health and cleanliness. One of the most persistent problems came from the small animals that found shelter within wooden buildings and food storage areas. Washing hands before meals helped reduce dirt during communal dining in medieval households. Yet even the cleanest table could not escape, another common problem of the time. Small animals and insects often lived inside homes, quietly sharing the same spaces where food was stored and prepared. Sharing living space with animals was not unusual in the medieval world, and not all of those animals were invited. Long before people noticed them directly, small creatures already moved quietly through the walls, floors, and storage areas of houses. Rats, mice, fleas, and many kinds of insects were part of the environment surrounding medieval homes. Their presence was so common that many people accepted it as an unavoidable aspect of everyday life. The design of medieval houses made it easy for these creatures to find shelter. Many homes were built from timber frames filled with clay or mud, a method known as wattle and daub. While this structure was protected from wind and rain, it also created small cracks and hidden spaces inside the walls. These narrow openings were perfect hiding places for rodents and insects seeking warmth and safety. Roofs constructed from thatch offered another comfortable refuge for small animals. Layers of straw or reeds were packed together to keep out rain, but they also created a thick environment where insects could nest easily. Birds sometimes hid within the roof as well, bringing small parasites along with them. Over time, these creatures became quiet residents of the house, living just above the heads of the people sleeping below. Food storage areas attracted even more unwanted visitors. Medieval households often kept grain, bread, and dried foods in wooden chests or storage rooms. These supplies were essential for survival, especially during the winter months when fresh food was scarce. Unfortunately, the smell of stored grain could travel far enough to attract mice and rats. Once they discovered a reliable food source, these animals returned again and again. Kitchens became another gathering place for pests. Food preparation left behind crumbs, scraps, and cooking residues that small creatures quickly discovered. Floors were usually made of packed earth or rough wooden boards, which allowed insects to hide easily between gaps or beneath loose soil. Even when households cleaned regularly, tiny pieces of food remained behind, enough to sustain insects and rodents. Cats sometimes served as the first line of defense against these unwelcome guests. Many homes kept cats specifically for their hunting abilities. A skilled cat could control the number of mice in a house and protect stored grain from being destroyed. Despite this help, however, rodents rarely disappeared entirely. They adapted quickly, finding new hiding places or entering buildings through small openings. Insects were even more difficult to control. Fleas, lice, and other tiny pests spread easily through bedding, clothing, and animals living nearby. Straw mattresses and wool blankets provided ideal environments where insects could hide during the day and emerge at night. People often noticed their presence only when bites appeared on the skin, or itching became impossible to ignore. For medieval communities, the challenge was not only discomfort, but also health. Though people did not understand bacteria or disease transmission in modern terms, they were aware that certain environments seemed to produce illness more often than others. Areas with large numbers of rodents or insects were sometimes associated with sickness, even if the exact cause remained mysterious. The connection between pests and disease would become clearer centuries later, but the conditions for that relationship already existed. Rodents moving between waste pits, kitchens and food stores carried dirt and contamination with them. Fleas and insects living on animals or humans could travel easily between houses in crowded towns. These small creatures quietly linked different parts of the urban environment. Despite these challenges, medieval people did not simply surrender to the presence of pests. Households developed various methods to reduce their numbers. Cats, traps, and simple barriers helped keep rodents away from valuable food supplies. Bedding was sometimes aired outside in sunlight to reduce insects hiding within the straw. Herbs with strong smells were occasionally placed in rooms to discourage certain pests from settling there. Even with these efforts, complete control remained impossible. The building materials, storage methods, and crowded conditions of medieval towns allowed small animals and insects to survive almost everywhere. Instead of eliminating them, people learned to live with their presence as part of the ordinary rhythm of life. Modern homes are built with sealed walls, treated materials, and pest control methods that reduce these problems significantly. In contrast, medieval houses existed in a closer relationship with the natural environment. The boundary between indoor and outdoor spaces was never fully sealed. Creatures that lived outside could often find their way inside with little difficulty. Understanding this environment helps explain why medieval hygiene practices sometimes focused on controlling odors, washing fabrics, and maintaining food storage, rather than eliminating pests. People worked with the tools available to them, addressing problems as best they could within the limits of their technology. Living alongside animals and insects shaped daily routines in ways that modern societies rarely experience. Food had to be protected carefully, bedding required attention, and even simple storage decisions could influence the comfort of a household. These small details formed an important part of everyday survival. Yet pest control was only one of the many tasks required to maintain a functioning household. Another demanding responsibility involved keeping clothing clean. In a world where washing fabrics required significant effort and time, rodents and insects lived quietly inside many medieval homes, sharing spaces where food was stored and meals were prepared. Yet keeping pests away was only one challenge facing households of the time. Washing clothing itself required long hours of physical labor that few modern people would expect from such a simple task. Washing clothing in the Middle Ages was not a quick household chore completed in a few minutes. It was a demanding task that required strength, patience, and a large amount of water. In a world without washing machines, pipes, or convenient plumbing, every piece of clothing had to be cleaned entirely by hand. The process could occupy several hours of labor and often involve more than one member of the household. Working together, clothing itself was valuable in medieval society, which made caring for it especially important. Fabrics such as wool and linen required time and effort to produce. A single garment might represent weeks of spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing by hand. Because clothing was costly and not easily replaced, families needed to keep their garments usable for as long as possible. Washing them properly became part of protecting this investment. The process usually began with gathering enough water for the task. Since most houses did not have direct access to running water, someone had to carry buckets from a well, river, or nearby stream. Washing large amounts of clothing required several containers, which meant repeated trips back and forth. In many villages and towns, people chose to wash clothing directly at the riverbank to avoid transporting so much water. Streams and rivers, therefore, became important places for this work. Women, servants, or household workers often traveled there, carrying bundles of garments that needed cleaning. The sound of running water mixed with the rhythm of scrubbing cloth against wooden boards or stones. Washing clothes was rarely a silent activity. Conversations frequently filled the air as people worked side by side along the banks. Once the garments were soaked, the next step involved removing dirt and oils that had collected in the fabric. Medieval households did not have modern detergents. Instead, they relied on simpler substances that could break down grease and loosen dirt. One of the most common materials used for this purpose was wood ash. Ash from household fires contains natural alkaline elements that could help clean fabric when mixed with water. The ash might be dissolved in water to create a rough cleaning solution, or it might be rubbed directly into the cloth. When combined with scrubbing and rinsing, the mixture helped lift dirt from the fibers of the fabric. Although this method lacked the pleasant fragrances of modern soap, it was surprisingly effective at removing stains and sweat. In some regions, people also produced simple forms of soap, using animal fat and ash. These early soaps were coarse and sometimes harsh on the skin, but they served the purpose of cleaning garments reasonably well. The soap was rubbed onto the cloth before vigorous scrubbing began. This part of the process demanded significant effort. Fabric had to be twisted, rubbed, and beaten repeatedly to release the dirt trapped within it. Large pieces of clothing, such as cloaks or heavy wool garments, required even more strength. When soaked with water, they became heavy and difficult to handle. Workers often lifted the cloth and struck it against stones or wooden boards to force dirt out of the fibers. This action had to be repeated again and again until the garment appeared clean enough to rinse. After scrubbing came the rinsing stage. Clean water was poured out, Ra splashed over the garments to remove soap, ash, and remaining dirt in rivers. This process was easier because flowing water carried away the residue. Even so, several rinses were often necessary before the cloth was ready to dry. Drying clothes took place outdoors whenever possible. Garments were spread across bushes, fences, or lines of rope stretched between posts. Sunlight and wind helped remove remaining moisture, while also reducing odors that might remain in the fabric. On clear days, this stage worked quickly, but during damp weather it could take much longer. Because the process required so much labor, families rarely washed all their clothing at once. Instead, they chose specific days to handle the task, often focusing on linen garments first, since these pieces needed more frequent cleaning. Larger wool garments were washed less often because they were harder to handle and more delicate when wet. The effort involved in washing clothes explains why certain hygiene habits developed in medieval society. As mentioned earlier, linen undergarments were worn beneath heavier clothing, partly because they could be cleaned more easily. By washing these lighter garments more often, people reduced the need to clean expensive outer clothing repeatedly. From a modern perspective, the entire routine appears exhausting. Today, machines wash, rinse, and spin clothing with minimal effort from the user. In the medieval world, however, every stage required physical work. Carrying water, scrubbing clothes, rinsing garments, and hanging them to dry demanded time and energy that could otherwise have been spent on farming, cooking, or other daily responsibilities. Yet despite these challenges, people still found ways to maintain their clothing carefully. Clean garments not only improved comfort, but also signaled respectability within the community. Wearing dirty clothing might suggest neglect or poverty, while well-maintained garments reflected discipline and care. Laundry, therefore, became an important part of maintaining household order. Even though the process was difficult, it helped keep fabrics usable and allowed people to present themselves properly in public life. Another area of household maintenance required similar attention. Bedding, especially mattresses filled with natural materials, also needed regular care to prevent unpleasant odors and hidden pests from building up over time. Washing clothing demanded hours of physical labor and careful attention in medieval households, yet garments were not the only household items that required regular cleaning. The beds people slept on each night could quietly collect moisture, insects, and unpleasant smells if they were not maintained properly. Sleeping arrangements in the Middle Ages were far simpler than the comfortable beds many people are used to today. A medieval bed was rarely a soft mattress filled with springs and foam. Instead, it was usually constructed from a wooden frame topped with a sack or mattress filled with natural materials. Straw was one of the most common fillings, though in some households feathers or animal hair might also be used. These materials were easy to obtain and inexpensive, making them practical choices for families across different social classes. At first glance, such bedding may have seemed adequate. Straw created a cushion between the sleeper and the hard wooden frame beneath. When freshly filled, it could even feel relatively comfortable compared with sleeping directly on the floor. Yet over time, the material inside the mattress began to change. Straw gradually compressed under the weight of the body, night after night. Moisture from the air and from human bodies slowly collected inside the bedding. Without proper care, the once fresh straw could become damp and unpleasant. For this reason, maintaining a bed required more attention than modern sleepers might expect. Periodically, the straw filling had to be removed and replaced. Families would empty the old material, clean the fabric covering if possible, and refill it with fresh straw gathered from fields or barns. This process restored the mattress to its original shape and prevented the accumulation of mold or unpleasant odor. Drying bedding outdoors was another important part of the routine. When the weather allowed, mattresses and blankets were sometimes carried outside and placed in the sunlight. Fresh air and warmth helped remove moisture trapped within the materials. Sunlight also discouraged insects that might hide among the straw. The sight of bedding hanging from windows or resting across fences could occasionally be seen in medieval towns during clear days. Despite the importance of these practices, they were not always performed as often as they should have been. The reason was simple. Replacing straw or carrying bedding outdoors required time and effort, and medieval households already faced many demanding tasks each day. Farming, cooking, collecting water, repairing tools, and caring for animals often took priority over the maintenance of mattresses. In poorer households, the situation could be even more challenging. Families might use the same straw bedding for long periods before replacing it. Over time, the material became flattened and dusty. Small fragments of straw broke apart, mixing with dirt carried into the house on clothing or shoes. Although people might shake the mattress or rearrange the filling occasionally, a full replacement of the straw could be delayed for months. Leather mattresses offered a slightly different experience. Wealthier families sometimes filled their bedding with feathers instead of straw. Feathers created a softer surface and were considered a sign of comfort and status. However, they also required regular care. Feathers could clump together when damp, forming uneven lumps inside the mattress. Like straw bedding, feather mattresses benefited from being aired in sunlight to maintain their quality. Blankets and covers added another layer to the medieval sleeping environment. Wool blankets were common because wool retained warmth, even during cold nights. Yet wool also absorbed moisture from the air and from the body. Without occasional airing or cleaning, these blankets could develop strong odors. Hanging them outdoors helped restore freshness and reduce the buildup of dampness. The importance of maintaining bedding went beyond comfort. Beds could easily become homes for insects if they were neglected for too long. Fleas and other small pests found straw mattresses particularly inviting. Warmth, darkness, and the presence of sleeping humans created ideal conditions for these insects to survive. Regularly replacing or airing bedding helped reduce the likelihood of infestations. Medieval people were not unaware of this problem. Even without modern scientific knowledge, they recognized that neglected bedding often led to itching and discomfort during the night. Households therefore developed routines aimed at minimizing these issues whenever possible. Shaking out blankets, airing mattresses, and replacing straw all formed part of this effort. Still, the effectiveness of these measures depended greatly on the resources and time available to each family. In busy urban households where space was limited, airing bedding outdoors might not always be convenient. Narrow streets and crowded buildings made it harder to find places where large mattresses could be laid out in the sun. As a result, some beds remained in use longer than ideal. From a modern perspective, the entire system might appear uncomfortable, yet it represented a practical adaptation to the materials available at the time. Straw, feathers, and wool were natural resources that could be gathered locally and reused repeatedly. Medieval households used what they had, developing routines that balanced effort with necessity. Looking back, the maintenance of bedding reveals another example of how daily hygiene functioned in a world without modern conveniences. Cleanness depended on regular attention rather than technology. Fresh air, sunlight, and manual labor replaced the chemical treatments and specialized materials that modern societies now rely upon. These sleeping arrangements also highlight the differences between social classes during the Middle Ages. Wealthier individuals could afford better bedding and more frequent replacements of materials. Poorer families relied on simpler solutions and often lived with greater discomfort as a result. Even so, the basic need for a clean sleeping space remained universal. Everyone required rest at the end of the day, and maintaining the bed was an essential step in preserving health and comfort within the home. Maintaining straw and feather mattresses required regular effort to keep them dry and free from insects. Yet, the quality of hygiene in medieval life often depended heavily on social class. Some people had access to private rooms, servants, and better bathing opportunities that were far beyond the reach of ordinary households. Life in the Middle Ages was strongly shaped by social class, and this difference could be seen clearly in matters of hygiene. While most ordinary people had to manage with limited water, shared spaces, and simple routines, wealthy nobles enjoyed a level of comfort that was far beyond the reach of common households. Inside large castles and manor houses, the living environment offered advantages that made personal cleanliness easier to maintain. One of the most noticeable differences was the availability of private rooms. In crowded village homes, or urban buildings, families often shared a single space where cooking, sleeping, and daily work all took place together. Privacy was rare in such conditions. In contrast, noble households within castles often contained separate chambers for sleeping, resting, and receiving visitors. These rooms allowed members of the household to carry out daily routines with far greater comfort. Servants played an important role in supporting these routines. Large noble households employed many workers, responsible for cooking, cleaning, carrying water, and preparing clothing. Tasks that required significant physical effort for ordinary people became easier when several individuals could assist. Water could be carried more quickly, fires could be maintained constantly, and rooms could be kept orderly with regular attention. This support made bathing more practical for the wealthy. Although castles rarely contained permanent bathing rooms in the modern sense, nobles often used portable tubs that could be brought directly into their private chambers. These tubs were usually made from wood and lined with cloth or metal. When a bath was desired, servants would carry buckets of heated water from the kitchen hearth and pour them into the tub until it was ready. Preparing such a bath required considerable effort. Several trips might be needed to bring enough hot water, and the fire had to be maintained long enough to heat it properly. For a noble household with many servants, however, this work could be completed without disrupting other activities. The result was a bathing experience far more comfortable than anything available to most villagers. Once the tub was filled, the bather could wash in relative privacy within their chamber. Curtains or screens might be arranged around the tub, and clean cloths were provided for drying afterward. Fresh garments waited nearby, allowing the individual to dress immediately after the bath. In comparison with the routines of ordinary people who relied on cloth washing or occasional outdoor baths, this arrangement felt almost luxurious. Bathing among the wealthy also carried social meaning. Cleanliness was associated with refinement and discipline, qualities that noble families wished to display. Maintaining a well-groomed appearance reinforced their status within society. Guests visiting a castle might notice the care taken in clothing, hair, and personal presentation. These details reflected not only personal habits, but also the resources available to support them. Even so, bathing was not necessarily an everyday activity, even for the wealthy. The process still required time and preparation, and the supply of hot water was not limitless. Baths were often taken when circumstances allowed or when special occasions approached. Preparing for a celebration, welcoming important visitors, or observing religious festivals sometimes provided reasons to arrange a full bath. Beyond bathing, nobles also benefited from other advantages related to hygiene. Their clothing was made from finer fabrics and maintained by servants who washed and repaired garments regularly. Bedding could be replaced more frequently, and rooms were often larger and better ventilated than those in small houses. These factors combined to create an environment that felt cleaner and more comfortable. Castles themselves were designed with certain practical features that supported sanitation. Multiple garderobes were often placed along the outer walls, so that waste could be removed from living areas. Kitchens were located in specific sections of the building, separating cooking smoke and food preparation from sleeping chamber. While these designs were far from modern standards, they still offered improvements over the crowded conditions of urban housing. The contrast between noble life and the experience of ordinary people could therefore be significant. A farmer living in a small cottage might share space with family members, animals, and stored supplies. Washing required carrying water from distant sources, and bathing occurred only on rare occasions. Meanwhile, a noble resident in a castle could summon servants to prepare a bath, deliver clean clothing, and maintain the room afterward. These differences illustrate how hygiene in the medieval world was closely connected to wealth and labor. Cleanliness required resources such as water, fuel, time, and human effort. Those who possessed greater resources could maintain higher standards of personal care. Those with fewer resources adapted their routines to the limitations surrounding them. Despite these contrasts, both rich and poor lived within the same broader environment of medieval sanitation. Even the most comfortable castle chamber still existed in a world without modern plumbing or scientific knowledge of disease. The methods available to maintain cleanliness were shaped by tradition, belief, and the practical realities of daily life. Understanding this divide between social classes helps explain why medieval hygiene practices appear so varied in historical records. Some accounts describe surprisingly comfortable bathing arrangements, while others reveal much simpler routines. Both perspectives were true, depending on who was being described. The experience of cleanliness in the Middle Ages was therefore never uniform. It depended heavily on where a person lived, the work they performed, and the resources available within their household. Wealth and status allowed noble households to maintain greater comfort and access to bathing than ordinary families. Yet, even among the wealthy, ideas about hygiene were shaped by beliefs that sometimes discouraged frequent bathing. Many people began to fear that too much contact with hot water could open the body to dangerous illnesses. Ideas about health in the Middle Ages were shaped as much by fear and observation as by scientific knowledge. People lived through outbreaks of illness that could sweep through towns with frightening speed. Families saw neighbors grow weak, entire streets fall silent, and communities struggled to understand what had happened. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, medieval societies tried to explain disease using the ideas available to them. Over time, some of these explanations influenced how people thought about bathing. One belief that became increasingly common suggested that hot water might actually make the body vulnerable to sickness. Medieval medical theories often described the body as protected by a delicate balance of natural forces. Skin was seen as a barrier that shielded the body from harmful influences in the surrounding air. If this barrier were weakened or opened, illness could supposedly enter more easily. Bathing, particularly in hot water, was thought by some to open the pores of the skin. According to the medical thinking of the time, these pores allowed heat and moisture to escape from the body. When they opened widely, people believed the body might also become exposed to dangerous vapors floating in the air. These invisible forces were often blamed for causing disease. The idea became more widespread after devastating epidemics struck various parts of Europe. When people searched desperately for explanations, many turned their attention to everyday habits that might influence health. Bathhouses, warm water, and steam-filled rooms began to appear suspicious to some observers. If illness spread easily in crowded places, perhaps bathing itself played a role. As a result, certain communities began to view frequent bathing with caution. While washing parts of the body remained common, full immersion in hot water became less frequent in some areas. People feared that leaving a bath with open pores might expose them to dangerous air outside. Instead of feeling refreshed, they worried that the warmth might weaken their natural defenses. Medical writers of the period sometimes reinforced these concerns. Influenced by earlier Greek and Roman theories of bodily balance, physicians described health as a delicate harmony between internal fluids and external conditions. Extreme temperatures, sudden changes in air, or excessive bathing were sometimes believed to disrupt this balance. Moderation became the guiding principle for many health recommendations. These ideas did not mean that everyone stopped bathing entirely. Practices varied widely across regions and social classes. Wealthy households with access to private tubs continued to enjoy baths when conditions seemed safe. In other places, however, people became more cautious about when and how often they washed their entire bodies. Some individuals preferred lukewarm water rather than very hot baths. Others limited bathing to certain seasons when the air was thought to be less dangerous. During cold weather, when illness seemed more common, people sometimes avoided baths altogether. Instead, they relied more heavily on cloth washing, changing linen garments, and using perfumes or herbs to maintain comfort. Looking at these beliefs today, it may seem strange that something as simple as bathing could be viewed with suspicion. Yet, in the medieval world, such ideas were part of a larger attempt to understand disease without modern science. When communities witnessed sudden waves of illness, they searched for patterns and causes in everyday life. Bathing, being a noticeable activity involving heat and moisture, naturally attracted attention. The fear of harmful air played an especially important role in these theories. Many people believed that diseases traveled through foul smells or invisible vapors rising from swamps, waste pits, or decaying matter. If the body was exposed to such air while the pores were open, illness might enter more easily. Avoiding frequent baths, therefore, seemed like a reasonable precaution. This mindset influenced public attitudes toward bathhouses as well. In some cities, the popularity of communal baths declined, partly because of these concerns. Warm rooms filled with steam and crowds of people began to feel risky in a time where disease outbreaks remained poorly understood. The same spaces that once symbolized cleanliness gradually became associated with potential danger. Despite these fears, everyday life still required people to maintain some level of hygiene. Hands were washed before meals, clothing was cleaned regularly, and linen garments were changed to absorb sweat. The medieval approach to cleanliness did not disappear entirely. Instead, it shifted toward methods that seemed less risky according to the beliefs of the time. Modern science eventually revealed that these fears were based on misunderstandings about how disease spreads. Hot water itself does not invite illness, and bathing is now recognized as one of the most effective ways to maintain personal hygiene. Yet the medieval perspective reflects the genuine uncertainty people faced when confronting mysterious diseases without the tools of modern medicine. Understanding these beliefs allows us to see medieval hygiene in a more nuanced way. People were not simply careless or indifferent to cleanliness. They were trying to protect themselves using the knowledge and theories available to them. Even when their conclusions appear unusual today, they represented thoughtful attempts to navigate a dangerous and unpredictable world. In the end, attitudes toward bathing illustrate how cultural beliefs can shape everyday habits. A simple act like taking a bath could carry complex meanings connected to health, safety, and tradition. Fear of disease led many medieval people to treat frequent bathing with caution rather than enthusiasm. Yet concerns about illness did not eliminate the desire for pleasant scents and personal comfort. Instead, people began relying even more on perfumes and aromatic substances to create a sense of cleanliness without using water. In medieval towns and castles, fragrance was not only a matter of luxury or fashion, it was also connected to how people believed the body could defend itself against disease. The air of medieval settlements was rarely neutral. Streets carried the smell of animals' food waste, smoke, and damp wood. Inside houses, the odor of cooking, sweat, and stored materials mixed in small spaces. In such an environment, pleasure and scents were more than decoration. They were thought to help protect the body. Medieval medicine often explained illness through the idea of corrupted air. According to this belief, invisible vapors, rising from decay, waste, or stagnant water, could enter the body and cause sickness. People could not see these vapors, but they believed the nose could detect them through foul smells. If bad air carried disease, then good smells were believed to push it away or weaken its effects. This idea made fragrance a practical tool in everyday life. Instead of relying only on washing, which could be difficult or time-consuming, people often surrounded themselves with pleasant scents. Herbs, oils, and resins became part of daily routines, especially among wealthier households who could afford a wide variety of aromatic materials. Many fragrant plants were easy to grow or gather. Rosemary, lavender, mint, sage, and thyme were among the most commonly used herbs. These plants had strong natural aromas that remained even after drying. Once harvested, the herbs were tied into bundles and hung inside homes to dry slowly. When crushed or warmed, they released their scent into the surrounding air. One popular method of using fragrance was the scented sachet. These small cloth bags were filled with dried flowers or herbs and then sewn shut. People placed them among clothing, under pillows, or inside chests where garments were stored. The scent spread gradually through the fabric, helping clothing smell fresh, even if it had not been washed recently. Nobles and wealthy merchants often carried scented objects when they left their homes. A common accessory was the pomander, a small metal container designed with decorative openings. Inside the container, people placed fragrant herbs, resins, or spices. The scent slowly escaped through the holes, surrounding the wearer with a gentle aroma as tea. Haywalked. Pomanders were sometimes worn on chains attached to belts or necklaces. Others were carried in the hand, especially when walking through crowded markets or narrow streets. The purpose was not only a pleasant fragrance, but also protection. People believed that inhaling sweet smells could shield the body from dangerous air. Perfumed oils were another important part of medieval grooming. These oils were made by soaking aromatic herbs or flowers in oil for long periods. The oil absorbed the scent of the plants, creating a liquid perfume that could be applied to skin or clothing. A small drop on the wrists, neck, or hair was enough to release fragrance throughout the day. Among noble households, perfume also carried a sense of elegance. Court life placed great importance on appearance, and fragrance became part of a refined presentation. Guests visiting a noble residence might notice the gentle scent of herbs or flowers in the rooms. These details suggested wealth, order, and careful attention to personal habits. Fragrance was not limited to personal items. Many homes used aromatic plants to improve the smell of entire rooms. Fresh herbs were sometimes scattered across floors or placed near fireplaces. As people walked through the room, the plants released their scent. This practice helped mask unpleasant odors and created a more comfortable atmosphere. In religious settings, fragrance held additional meaning. Churches often burned incense during ceremonies. The rising smoke filled the building with a strong, sweet aroma that many people associated with purity and holiness. The same belief that linked pleasant smells with protection also connected them with spiritual cleanliness. Although nobles possessed the most elaborate perfumes, simpler versions were used by many ordinary people as well. Rural households could gather aromatic plants from gardens, fields. Drying these plants required little effort, and once prepared, they could last for months. Even a small bundle of herbs hanging in a room could improve the smell of a house. Markets also sold small packets of fragrant herbs. These inexpensive items allowed people to purchase scent without the cost of expensive oils or imported spices. Carrying a pouch of herbs in a pocket or sleeve became a common habit for travelers and workers moving through crowded towns. Looking at these practices today, it becomes clear that fragrance served several purposes at once. It improved comfort in environments where unpleasant smells were common. It reflected social status and refinement among the wealthy. Most importantly, it gave people a sense of protection against illness in a world where the true causes of disease were still unknown. Medieval societies, therefore, developed a culture where scent was closely tied to ideas of health. Pleasant aromas were not simply enjoyable. They were part of a strategy to create a safer and more comfortable life in crowded towns and castles. Even though these beliefs were based on incomplete knowledge, they reveal how seriously people took the challenge of living in a difficult environment. Fragrance became a small but meaningful way to control the atmosphere around them. Fragrant herbs, oils, and scented objects allowed medieval people to feel protected from the unpleasant air surrounding their daily lives. Yet, scent alone could not hide every sign of the body's presence. The next detail of personal care was visible to everyone, especially in public spaces where appearance mattered greatly. Hair and beards needed constant attention, and neglecting them could damage a person's reputation immediately. Walking through a medieval town street would have been a very different experience from walking through a modern city. Roads were narrow, uneven, and often covered with layers of mud and debris. Buildings stood close together, and many daily activities took place directly outside the doorways of homes and shops. Cooking, selling goods, repairing tools, and handling animals all happened along the same streets where people walked. Because of this, waste and dirt accumulated easily. Despite this reality, medieval towns were not completely indifferent to cleanliness. Many city authorities recognized that uncontrolled waste created problems for both comfort and health. Over time, some towns introduced rules requiring residents to remove garbage from the streets. These rules often instructed householders to sweep the area in front of their homes or to dispose of refuse in designated places. The intention behind these laws was simple. If each household took responsibility for its immediate surroundings, the streets, as a whole, would remain more manageable. In theory, this shared responsibility could reduce the buildup of waste and make travel through the town easier. However, the success of these regulations depended greatly on how seriously they were followed. Medieval cities did not have organized sanitation departments like modern municipalities. Instead, enforcement relied on local officials or community pressure. Some neighborhoods carried out the cleaning duties regularly, while others paid little attention to them. In areas where residents cooperated, the streets might appear relatively tidy for short periods of time. People swept dirt away from their doorsteps and gathered rubbish into piles that could later be removed. Water might be thrown across the ground to settle dust or wash away smaller debris. These efforts created moments when the streets seemed reasonably clean. Yet, these improvements were rarely permanent. The daily rhythm of medieval life quickly replaced whatever had been cleared. Horses and carts moved through the roads constantly, leaving behind manure and mud. Market stalls generated food scraps and packaging. Animals kept by households added their own waste to the street environment. Rain also played a powerful role in shaping the condition of medieval roads. When heavy rain fell, unpaved streets turned into thick mud. Dirt mixed with refuse already present on the ground, creating a slippery surface that was difficult to walk across. In dry weather, the mud hardened, but dust and fragments of waste remained scattered across the road. Another challenge came from the way houses and workshops handled their waste. Many households did not have convenient systems for storing garbage. Instead, unwanted materials were often placed temporarily outside until someone had time to remove them. During busy days, these piles could remain for long periods. Some cities attempted to control this problem by setting specific times when waste could be thrown into the street for collection. Residents were expected to follow these schedules, but in practice, the rules were not always respected. When enforcement was weak, individuals simply disposed of waste whenever it was convenient. Markets presented another difficulty for maintaining cleanliness. Large gatherings of sellers and buyers produced large amounts of rubbish in a short time. Vegetable scraps, fish remains, broken containers, and spilled food often remained on the ground after the market closed. Unless someone cleared the area quickly, the street would remain messy for the rest of the day. Medieval streets were therefore places where order and disorder existed side by side. A freshly swept section of road might appear tidy near one house, while only a few steps away, the ground could be covered in mud and debris. The condition of the street often reflected the habits of the people living nearby. City off. Issues sometimes tried to strengthen enforcement by imposing fines on those who ignored sanitation rules. In theory, these penalties encouraged residents to keep their surroundings cleaner. In reality, however, collecting fines consistently proved difficult. Officials could not monitor every street at every moment, and many violations went unnoticed. The lack of consistent cleaning systems meant that medieval streets constantly changed in appearance. After a day of sweeping and clearing, a road might look relatively orderly. Within hours, however, the ordinary flow of urban life could restore the familiar mixture of dirt, animal waste, and scattered rubbish. For the people who lived in these towns, such conditions gradually became part of daily experience. Residents learned where the worst patches of mud were located and which alleys were easiest to walk through after rain. They adapted their movements to the environment, rather than expecting the environment to remain perfectly clean. From a modern viewpoint, this might seem uncomfortable. Yet, medieval townspeople understood that maintaining perfect cleanliness was nearly impossible with the tools available to them. Sweeping, carrying waste, and washing the ground could improve conditions temporarily, but the constant activity of city life quickly reversed these efforts. Even so, the presence of sanitation rules shows that people were aware of the importance of managing waste. Medieval communities were not entirely careless about their surroundings. They simply worked within limits created by technology, resources, and population density. These streets formed the stage where everyday life unfolded. Merchants sold goods, travelers passed through town gates, and neighbors met outside their homes. The mixture of mud, noise, and activity became the normal background of urban life during the Middle Ages. Medieval towns attempted to control waste with rules and occasional cleaning, yet the results were often temporary and uneven. Streets could be swept one day and covered again with mud and debris the next. The smell that rose from these busy roads became one of the most unforgettable features of medieval urban life. And understanding that smell reveals just how overwhelming the atmosphere of a medieval city could be. Understanding disease in the Middle Ages was shaped by a very different way of thinking about the human body and the surrounding world. Today, people know that microscopic organisms cause many illnesses. Yet, medieval societies had no concept of bacteria or viruses. The tools needed to observe such tiny forms of life did not exist. Without microscopes or laboratory science, people relied instead on observation, tradition, and inherited medical ideas to explain why sickness appeared. For medieval communities, illness was rarely invisible in its effects. Fever, coughing, weakness, and sudden death were common experiences, especially in crowded towns where sanitation was limited. People saw the consequences of disease every year, but the true cause remained hidden. Since germs could not be seen, they could not become part of the explanation. Instead, many medieval thinkers turned to older theories that had been passed down from ancient medical traditions. One of the most influential ideas came from the belief that the human body contained a balance of internal fluids, known as humors. According to this theory, health depended on keeping these humors in harmony. If the balance was disturbed, sickness could appear. Within this framework, many factors were believed to affect the body's balance. Food, weather, emotions, and even smells were thought to influence health. Strong odors or foul air were particularly feared because they seemed to accompany many outbreaks of disease. Hen people walked through areas filled with decay or waste and later became ill. It appeared logical that the air itself might carry the cause. This belief developed into what historians call the theory of miasma. According to this idea, disease spread through poisonous vapors rising from rotting material, stagnant water, or overcrowded places. These vapors were believed to enter the body through breathing or through the pores of the skin. If someone inhaled corrupted air, illness might follow. Because of this understanding, many hygiene practices in medieval life were aimed at controlling smells rather than eliminating microorganisms. Fresh air was considered healthy, while foul odors were dangerous. Opening windows, burning fragrant herbs, and avoiding areas that smelled unpleasant were all seen as sensible precautions. This perspective influenced how people approached cleanliness. Washing the body could help remove dirt and unpleasant smells, but it was not understood as a way to remove invisible organisms. Instead, washing was often connected to comfort, appearance, and the idea of balancing the body's internal conditions. Medical advice from the period reflects these beliefs clearly. Physicians often recommended moderation in everyday habits. Eating certain foods, maintaining calm emotions, and avoiding extreme weather were all seen as ways to protect health. Clean surroundings were encouraged, but the focus remained on preventing exposure to bad air rather than eliminating microbes. These ideas also shaped how communities responded to epidemics. When disease spread rapidly through a town, attention often focused on environmental factors such as foul-smelling streets or stagnant water sources. Efforts were made to remove rotting waste, improve airflow, or relocate populations away from suspected sources of harmful air. Although these methods did not address the true cause of infection, they sometimes produced helpful side effects. Removing waste and improving ventilation could reduce some conditions that allow diseases to spread more easily. In this way, certain medieval hygiene efforts accidentally contributed to better health, even though the underlying reasoning was incomplete. Looking back from a modern perspective, the absence of knowledge about bacteria might appear as a major limitation. Yet, it is important to recognize that medieval societies were working with the best explanations available to them at the time. Scientific discovery develops gradually, and the tools needed to identify microorganisms would not appear until many centuries later. Despite the lack of microbiological understanding, medieval people still valued cleanliness in many forms. Hands were washed before meals, clothing was cleaned regularly, and living spaces were maintained as carefully as possible within available resources. These habits reflected a general awareness that order and cleanliness improved daily life. The difference between medieval hygiene and modern hygiene lies mainly in the reasons behind these practices. Today, people wash their hands to remove germs that cannot be seen. In the Middle Ages, the same action might be performed to remove dirt, improve appearance, or avoid unpleasant smells. Knowledge of bacteria, would eventually transform how societies approached sanitation and medicine. Once scientists discovered that microscopic organisms cause disease, new methods of prevention emerged. Sterilization, vaccination, and systematic public sanitation programs became possible. However, during the medieval period, these discoveries still lay far in the future. Communities continued to rely on inherited ideas about balance, air quality, and personal habits to guide their approach to health. Understanding this difference helps explain many aspects of medieval hygiene that might otherwise seem unusual. Without knowledge of microbes, people focused on the factors they could observe directly, such as smell, climate, and visible dirt. The absence of germ theory, therefore, shaped the entire framework through which medieval societies understood sickness and cleanliness. Their hygiene practices were logical within that worldview. Even though modern science would eventually reveal a different explanation, medieval people built their understanding of health around the ideas of balance and the danger of foul air rather than invisible organisms. These beliefs influenced how they cleaned their homes, washed their bodies, and organized their cities. Yet despite these limitations, some everyday habits they practiced turned out to be surprisingly effective in protecting health, even though they did not know exactly why. Daily life in the Middle Ages often appears extremely unsanitary when viewed from the perspective of modern society. Streets could be muddy, waste was sometimes visible in public spaces, and scientific understanding of disease had not yet developed. Yet, despite these limitations, medieval people were not completely careless about cleanliness. In fact, several ordinary habits that appeared simple or even insignificant actually helped maintain a basic level of hygiene within their communities. One of the most common of these habits was washing hands before eating. Medieval meals were usually eaten directly with the fingers rather than with forks or other utensils. Bread, meat, vegetables, and fruit were lifted from shared dishes and placed directly into the mouth. Because of this style of eating, clean hands became an important part of proper behavior at the table. Before a meal began, a servant or member of the household would often bring a bowl of water to the table. Guests were invited to rinse their hands before touching the food. Sometimes water was poured slowly from a small pitcher over the fingers while another person held a basin underneath. Towels were then provided so that diners could dry their hands before the meal started. Although medieval people performed this ritual mainly for reasons of politeness and appearance, the effect was surprisingly beneficial. Washing hands removes visible dirt, grease, and other substances that have accumulated during daily work. In doing so, it also removed many microorganisms that could cause illness, even though people at the time had no idea such organisms existed. Another practical habit involved the use of linen undergarments. Most people wore a layer of linen clothing beneath their outer garments. Linen was chosen because it was relatively light, breathable, and easier to wash than heavier fabrics like wool. This inner layer rested directly against the skin and absorbed sweat throughout the day. Because linen garments were easier to clean, they could be washed more frequently than outer clothing. Even when bathing was rare, changing the linen layer helped reduce odor and remove accumulated dirt from the body. In effect, the undergarment worked like a protective filter between the skin and the outer clothing. Outer garments made from wool or heavier fabrics were far more difficult to wash. Washing them required large amounts of water and significant effort. For this reason, they were cleaned less often. The linen layer beneath them, therefore, played a crucial role in maintaining a sense of freshness. Laundry itself was an important household activity. Clothing was often washed by hand in wooden tubs filled with water. Ash or simple soap mixtures were used to help remove grease and stains. After washing, garments were hung outdoors to dry in fresh air and sunlight. Sunlight had an additional benefit that medieval people did not fully understand. Exposure to sunlight helped kill certain microorganisms and reduce the growth of mold in damp fabric. Even though people did not know about microbes, the practice of drying clothing outdoors improved hygiene in subtle ways. Another everyday habit that supported cleanliness was sweeping the floors of living spaces. Houses were often constructed with simple wooden or earthen floors that collected dust and debris easily. Sweeping removed visible dirt and made the home environment more comfortable. Beds and bedding were also sometimes aired outside in sunlight. Mattresses filled with straw or feathers could trap moisture and odor if left indoors for too long. Placing them outside allowed fresh air to circulate through the materials. This helped keep the bedding dry and reduced the presence of insects. Food preparation routines also offered unexpected hygienic benefits. Raw ingredients were often prepared separately from cooked food, simply for practical reasons. Cooks knew that spoiled ingredients could ruin an entire meal, so they handled them carefully. While this practice was based on taste and convenience, it also reduced certain forms of contamination. Drinking habits occasionally helped as well. In some areas, people drank ale or diluted wine instead of untreated water. Brewing and fermentation processes often kill harmful organisms present in water sources. Although medieval people chose these drinks primarily for flavor and tradition, the results sometimes reduced exposure to contaminated water. Taken together, these habits reveal a pattern of practical wisdom developed through observation and experience. Medieval communities noticed that certain routines made life more comfortable and helped families avoid sickness. Over time, these behaviors became traditions passed down from one generation to the next. This does not mean that medieval hygiene matched modern standards. Many risks remained, and outbreaks of disease could still spread rapidly through towns and villages. However, the picture is more complex than the common assumption that medieval people ignored cleanliness entirely. Instead, their approach to hygiene focused on what they could see and feel. Visible dirt, unpleasant smells, and personal comfort guided their habits. Within that framework, several of their everyday routines turned out to be surprisingly effective. The persistence of these practices also shows how culture can preserve useful knowledge, even without scientific explanation. People continued performing certain actions simply because they seemed to work. Washing hands before meals, changing linen clothing regularly, and airing bedding outdoors all became part of ordinary household discipline. Looking back today, these habits form a bridge between ancient traditions and modern hygiene practices. The motivations may have changed, but the actions themselves remain familiar. Medieval people lacked knowledge about bacteria, yet several of their daily habits quietly helped maintain a level of cleanliness. Washing hands and changing linen garments created small barriers against illness in a difficult environment. Even so, personal routines were only one part of medieval hygiene, and powerful institutions like the church also influenced how people understood cleanliness and daily life.